Good afternoon. In this webinar, we will be exploring the latest research evidence which builds on a decade of studies on EAL pupils and their educational attainment conducted by the Department of Education at the University of Oxford and how it can inform effective school support for these learners. Today, we have a panel of 3 speakers, and at the end, there will be time to ask any questions that you may have. It gives me great pleasure to introduce today's speakers in the order in which they will speak. First, we will listen to Dr. Ariel Lindorf, lead author of the report and Associate Professor of Education at the Department of Education, University of Oxford. Ariel is a chartered statistician and a former teacher of nearly a decade, and she leads a substantial portfolio of research with a focus on educational equity and effectiveness, and has advised on policy in England and abroad. Ariel has been involved in this research program looking at EAL and educational achievement for the last 5 years in collaboration with Professor Steve Strand, OBE. Our second speaker will be Susanna Zajakowska. Susanna is a class teacher at St. Mary's Catholic School in Black Hill. She has been teaching for 6 years and developed a strong passion for supporting EAL learners during her master's studies, which allowed her to reflect deeply on her own experiences as an EAL learner after moving to England from Poland at the age of 10. Susanna is a Bell Foundation licensed practitioner and teaches teachers how to provide effective support to help EAL pupils succeed. Our third and final speaker will be Joe Martin, Multilingual Learner Advisory for Secondary Swansea Council. Joe supports secondary schools with the local authority to develop and embed effective EAL practice. She runs EAL training, advice and guidance to schools and school staff. Joe has worked with academics from the University of Reading to gather a portfolio of moderated samples of EAL learners' work assessed against the Bell Foundation's EAL assessment framework for schools. Enough of me. So, Ariel, let's begin with you. Can you provide us with some background to this new report and how it came about?
Of course. So this is the sixth and final one of a series of reports that have been going on for the past decade. So there's a research program that has led up to this particular report. And the beginning of that was actually with a very similar report looking at data from England in 2013 and trying to understand really just the patterns of who was in that EAL group and how they were attaining at various stages of their education. So coming around 10 years from that, really the purpose of this report was to catch up on what's happened since then, how have those patterns changed, and what might that mean for what the needs of pupils are, what the needs of schools are, and what we need to be looking at in policy around support for pupils in England.
Thank you. And can you tell us what the 3 main findings of the report have been?
Absolutely. If I could just have the slides that go with those, that would be absolutely brilliant. Lovely. So one of the really important findings from this report concerns the sheer kind of prevalence and growth of the group of EAL learners in England. You can see, hopefully from the slide, that this group overall has more than tripled since 1997. So if we look back to 1997, we had a much lower prevalence in terms of the percent and the sheer number of pupils in the EAL group. And if we look to 2024, which is the most recent data in this series in front of you, we're looking at much higher numbers, but much higher percent as well of EAL learners. So roughly speaking, that corresponds to what you see here corresponds to about 7.6% of the school-age population in 1997 and over 20% in 2023 and still increasing after that. So I think the message there to drive home really just is that this is a growing group. This is a growing group, not just in absolute numbers, but in the proportion of pupils that have EAL status. And the one other thing to look at here that's interesting to reflect on kind of as a teacher, possibly, certainly as a school leader, is what's going on with the pattern of primary and secondary prevalence of EAL pupils, where we see something different going on, and it suggests to us that possibly the way that EAL status flag is being recorded in the transition from primary to secondary might be something to look at very carefully, because it seems like sometimes pupils may not be carrying that with them across the transition in the way that the kind of definition of EAL might suggest. But the main message here is really just about prevalence and growth of that group, and making it a really important group for us to consider. If we could move to the next slide, please. The other thing about this is not just how many pupils are in this group, but also where they are in England. And so if you look at the map on the left, that's from 2013. The map on the right is from 2023. And across that decade that I mentioned, where we're trying to look at how our patterns of the population of EAL pupils changing, what you can see, hopefully fairly clearly here, is that in the earlier map, there was a real concentration of EAL pupils in certain, particularly urban centers. And what we see happening over those 10 years is a spread outwards, or a shift outwards in that population. And so there are schools that may previously not have had EAL pupils to support that now do. And that has some real implications for, what the needs are of schools in order to be able to offer that support. So that shift outward from urban centers, again, is also a really important finding from just being able to describe who and where the EAL pupils in England are. If we could move on to the next slide, please. The third really important finding from this research, and it does tally with findings from research on the same topic elsewhere, is that we see pupils who join the school system later have a harder time catching up by the end of key stage. So on the left, we have primary school pupils. We have looking at along the bottom, the year in which they join the school, as thinking of that as the year in which a pupil joins the school system. The later they join, you can see the larger the gap is between EAL learners and monolingual English speakers. And what this means in plain terms is basically, we can see if you join after reception and you're an EAL learner, it becomes more difficult to catch up by the end of Key Stage 2 in terms of what we can see here with Key Stage 2 reading results. And on the right, we have for secondary school, if we look at, again, the year in which a pupil joins the school or joins school in England, we see this as appearing in the National Pupil Database. So as a proxy for when a pupil arrived in England. The later a pupil arrives, the larger we start to see the gaps becoming by the end of Key Stage 4 when they take their GCSEs. And so basically, this is reinforcing a message that we have from previous research, where collectively, the research that we have previously and other research on multilingual learners in the world, we see that it generally takes up to 6 years, or around 6 years on average, to acquire the kind of language proficiency that's needed to engage with academics. And so here we're seeing a very similar pattern where it really takes 6 years to catch up. And if a pupil arrives after year 5 or arrives after reception, it becomes really difficult to catch up on average in terms of end of key stage attainment. Hopefully that comes across fairly clearly, but obviously I would welcome questions at the end.
Thank you. Very important findings. In terms, we have an audience here of practitioners in the main. So what would be the key practical recommendations for schools and practitioners that arise from this research?
I think I'll mention 3. One in particular, thinking back on what we saw about the patterns of sort of where EAL pupils are now, really concerns just thinking about changes in school intake and what implications that might have for the needs for support. So what this means probably realistically is building whole school capacity, thinking about universal training and how to best support pupils who speak an additional language, particularly those new to English, and thinking about classroom norms that support language, thinking about school-wide routines and resources, so that sort of thing. So again, just thinking about building whole school capacity around EAL support. The second one is really around targeting and intensive support for those who arrive later. So thinking about whether some high intensity interventions for those pupils who join school later might be appropriate, what those might be, looking at what the evidence is for those that might work best, and coordinating support as well across teams so that there's no misidentification of things like special educational needs rather than language support needs. The third one would be around maybe the need to strengthen homeschool communication and things like support for families of pupils that arrive later. So thinking about how they're welcomed, how those relationships are developed in order to have coordinated support for those pupils who need it most.
Thank you. And what would be the implications for education policy, particularly with reference to EAL? So what would be the main recommendations for policymakers?
So again, I'll mention three, and these are the ones that we pull out in the report as well. A really major one is around the need for 6 years funding targeted to support the learners who need it the most, which we see being the ones who, for example, join later, where previous funding structures that we've seen, around, for example, 3 years of support, really just clearly aren't enough to support the acquisition of the kind of proficiency that's needed to engage in academic study. So that's one. The second one is about the need to reintroduce statutory assessment of English language proficiency in England. We see this already in place in the other countries of the UK. And so it just seems really clear that a measure of proficiency is really important because that is an important predictor of attainment. It's in some of the previous studies we've had, the most important predictor. We can't look at that here because we don't have the proficiency measure, but we know how important it is. So reintroducing that would be a really good step in the right direction. And the final one is just thinking about the increasing geographical dispersion of EAL learners, the need for provision of training and continuing professional development around EAL support so that teachers can appropriately assess pupils' proficiency and so that there can be targeted and effective support responding to the needs that come out of that assessment. I hope those are all clear as well. But again, it's worth engaging around questions on any of that if they come up.
We will collect the questions and post them to you. Just a quick clarification for those of you who are not in the system between 2016 and 2018. Ariel is talking about the reintroduction of statutory assessment of proficiency in English because the DFE introduced that between those years, 2016 and 2018, and then in England, and then it was removed. Thank you, Ariel. Thank you very much. One last question for you. What would you say? Would you like to say a little bit more about having a SEND or FSM eligibility? How does it impact EAL learning attainment?
Sure. From what we see in the data, I'll speak to free school meal eligibility first. What we see there is we don't see a really different risk for low attainment for EAL learners than we do for others. And what that seems to be in terms of, a reason for that really is that in that EAL learner group, we have a lower kind of base for comparison. It's less of an issue of free school meals in particular for that group, I suppose, is a way to summarize this. The special educational needs, on the other hand, we do see lower attainment for those with special educational needs within the EAL learner group relative to the monolingual English speaking group. And so that could be for a number of different reasons. It may be the complexity of providing multiple types of support. It may be the complexity of assessing what the actual needs are. And some possible conflation of special educational needs with language support needs. Hard to know exactly what the source of that is, but we do know there's a differential risk. Pupils with EAL do seem to have special educational needs as a stronger risk factor for low attainment. So that's something worth considering kind of in your school context. I suppose, whether that seems to be the pattern that you see. Does that resonate with what's going on with pupils in a school? And if so, is it something to do with how needs are being assessed and that, um, if that's helpful?
Thank you very much. We'll bring you back with questions from the audience, Ariel. Thank you.
Sure.
So now let's hear from Susanna. And Susanna, could we have your thoughts and experiences working with the EAL learners in a primary school setting? Now, my first question to you is if you can very briefly tell us about your personal experience as an EAL learner and now as a primary teacher.
Absolutely. Yeah, so I moved to England from Poland when I was 10. And at the time, I spoke very little English. And I just remember this deep feeling of frustration because I sort of understood the content, from the general context, but couldn't express myself. And so I felt like teachers often assumed that I just didn't know the work. And then I think that deeply affected my confidence. And so when then I became a teacher, I sort of reflected on that, and that experience really taught me how vital it is to separate language ability from cognitive ability, and really to never underestimate children based on what they can say and express verbally. So really now as a primary school teacher, I make sure that my EAL pupils feel valued and supported, and not just academically, but also emotionally and socially.
Thank you, Susanna. So what changes do you notice in recent primary school cohorts in terms of the need for EAL support, and do they reflect in your setting the findings from the report?
Yes, they definitely reflect the findings of the report. Of course, the report says that now about 22% of primary pupils have a first language other than English. Of course, this is there is some regional variation. So in some areas it's much higher, and some it's lower. And even within the schools that I worked with, I've seen a lot of variation, but overall, I've seen more diversity and an increase in the uptake of EAL learners. And I think it's important to know it's not just European languages, but it's also Arabic, Urdu, Mandarin in particular. Of course, it's not true for all schools, but what it does mean for many schools is that obviously teachers now need strategies for a really wide range of linguistic and cultural backgrounds, which I think can't be forgotten about. And they do often need to be bespoke to an individual child or a group of children, depending on their exposure of language, their point of entry, and their current ability as well. And of course, the challenges that we're finding is that provision is inconsistent because there's no national policy in England and Wales. So schools often rely on individual teacher expertise.
Mm, thank you. So can you tell us a little bit about how proficiency in English is assessed in your school and why the school has decided that that was the right approach to take?
Yeah, so the schools I worked with was the Bell Foundation EAL assessment framework. It's a very structured tool, and it looks at speaking, listening, reading, and writing separately. And this really helps schools set this initial baseline when pupils arrive, and then allows them to track their progress over time. And it's really essential because attainment data alone doesn't tell us the full story. Um, and obviously, language proficiency impacts access to the curriculum, and without this, pupils can be misjudged as underachieving when actually the real barrier is language, and it goes a bit deeper than just being able to speak and comprehend. But it's like I mentioned, all these cultural aspects, and therefore interventions really need to be tailored and adapted to the individual needs of the child. And the framework really supports planning really targeted interventions and selecting what's appropriate for each pupil.
That's good to hear. What are the main challenges that you find when it comes to assessing proficiency in English for primary learners?
Yeah, so there are several challenges. So I think one of the main things that we found is distinguishing EAL needs and SEND needs. So language delay can look a lot like learning difficulty and vice versa. So obviously misidentification of that can lead to inappropriate interventions. Another thing that we find is teacher confidence. Like many teachers just feel unsure about what really proficiency, what it looks like and how to measure progress, and actually saying, okay, we found this out, but what's next? What do we do? We've got a variety of children. How do we make sure that we allow them all the same access to the curriculum and the same sort of the same access and the same, for them to feel included. I think in schools we lack time and lack resources. Assessment takes time. Schools often prioritize other needs, especially when we've got when there is policy that that does prioritize other needs, and the lack of training. So often schools don't know where to start. I think going back to cultural factors as well, pupils may have really strong literacy in their home language, but this isn't always recognized, and it's hard to tell, especially if family members maybe don't speak English well and they can't express that. We mentioned the point of entry, where we need quick and bespoke interventions, but again, it's when do we find the time? Where do we have the resources? Can we assess them properly? And training is inconsistently delivered. Very little training for ECTs, very little training for during initial teacher training. So I think a lot of those challenges are linked, and we find that each school sort of finds their own way around it, but again, it's very difficult and time consuming.
Really important challenges. Thank you for pointing those out. And while I was listening to you, I was thinking of two things. That one, when you were talking about confidence and not every teacher having the confidence to teach multilingual classrooms, that echoes the findings of a report that the Bell Foundation commissioned that's called EAL in CPD. In IT. If we can then tomorrow maybe send a link to that report, because it's really interesting. It's kind of a deep, a deep look at what's happening in initial teacher education and what the issues are and what suggestions and recommendations are. And the second point about the challenge of sometimes separating out or telling what is a SEND issue and what is an EAL support need. Again, just to highlight that at the Foundation, we have published guidance with lots of practical tools on EAL and SEND, which we can again link tomorrow when we send you all the information about the webinar for you to have a look at. Thank you. Just another question for you, Susanna. What practical strategies for supporting EAL learners and fostering inclusive classrooms do you deploy in your school? And what is the impact of using those strategies?
Yeah, so we use a range of strategies, some which I think will be familiar to practitioners. One of them is scaffolding, obviously breaking tasks into manageable steps, using sentence starters, starting with very basic language and adapting it to the child. I absolutely love visual support and visual clues and use of sensors, music, pictures, diagrams, real objects for them to touch, to experience, to make the meaning clear. I mean, AI is a great tool for it. Use it as much as possible. Save yourself time. And any technology that you can use, it's fantastic. And a lot of it is free and available. It just takes a little bit of time to find it. Pre-teaching vocabulary, giving pupils keywords before the lesson so they feel prepared. And again, join that with the visuals. Sometimes find things in their home language as well. Collaborative learning is really important. Parent and EAL pupil with support of peers for group work. If you've got a child who is maybe a bit more fluent, who speaks the same language, fantastic. If you're that lucky, use it. Children love to help each other. Translanguaging, we found it really useful to allow pupils to use their home language as a resource. again, it helps build their confidence, bridges understanding, it helps them to express themselves a little bit. And even though we might not understand it at first, they might be able to talk around it a little bit and have that conversation. And then I think that allows them to join families, any other speakers of that language, to join that conversation and make that learn a little bit deeper. We find that including community members and families helps. So at my old school that I still I'm in contact with, we've had a really strong Polish community. So we had some parents who felt more confident, help and come in and do some learning about the Polish culture with the staff, but then also come into class and sort of help the children and help them feel a bit more confident and understood. So the impact is vast and varied. Pupils tend to engage more, they feel a bit more included, and we find that they do make faster progress in both language and their curriculum subjects. And I think it also benefits the whole class, all children, because strategies, obviously visuals and scaffolding, they support all learners. So it doesn't need to be for that one particular child, it can be a whole class strategy, and then again that child doesn't then feel different or excluded in any way.
Thank you very much. And of course, you don't need to speak all the children's languages to be able to use methodologies that use the students' home languages or preferred languages. Thank you so much. So now we will move, as children do, from primary to secondary, and we'll bring Jo. So Jo, as I said before, she's based in Swansea. And can you tell us a little bit about how Wales differs from England with respect to data collection regarding pupils who have English as an additional language and their proficiency in English?
Okay, so just to provide some context, based on our PLASC level data, that's a pupil level annual school census, there's around 11% of pupils in Wales are EAL learners. Every local authority in Wales has EAL learners, although there is significant variability across Wales and within local authorities. So within some local authorities, you may have learners at schools where there are no EAL learners at all, but also schools where they have 90% plus EAL learners, and that's within the same local authority. The data that is collected for PLASC is a Welsh Government requirement, and they require us to gather information on the proficiency of English of EAL learners based on our 5-stage model A to E. We need to provide ethnic background information and first language information. The first language in Wales has a specific definition, which is a child first learning as a small child and have been exposed to it. So in Wales, you're an EAL learner if you speak another language other than English and or Welsh. So as I say, we've been assessing for English language proficiency since 2009. So we've got a lot of data there, which has been used in other research as well. But some schools and some local authorities were gathering that and using the assessment 5-stage model prior to 2009. Our curriculum also explicitly references the 5-stage model and has the expectation that schools, English and Welsh medium schools, are using the 5-stage model to consider progress of EAL learners as well. The Bell Foundation Assessment Framework, another mention for you. The Bell Foundation Assessment Framework has similar descriptors to the 5-stage model that we have in Wales. So as a local authority, Swansea recommends that the Bell Foundation Assessment Framework is used, and then that offers consistency across all of our schools. As well as that, we often advise our schools, as well as the annual collection of data, we advise our schools to assess termly as well, so that you're monitoring progress within the year, and you can then use the Bell Foundation assessment with the 10 statements there really help in monitoring progress within stages, because obviously in secondary, well, and it may be primary as well, but I'm more au fait with the secondary, you do tend to have plateauing of stages where learners can be staying on usually stage C or D, they are making progress, but within that stage, you don't always see it if you're just giving the C or D stage there. And really, I mean, ultimately, it's not about assessing just to get a stage. You need the stage in order to use that information to inform teacher planning and next steps and targeting of support for learners. So there's a lot of quite rich data in Wales, I think.
Fantastic. And that C reminds me of research on the intermediate plateau, doesn't it? It seems to reflect that, your data.
Yeah.
Thank you. So how does gathering all this information that you have been doing since 2009, amazingly, help both councils and secondary schools identify learning needs and plan for support?
Well, the local authorities have flexibility to use their minority ethnic Gypsy Roma traveller grant funding. So they can therefore tailor their service delivery model according to the local needs of the local authority. So by having this vital data about EAL learners, councils can understand the demographics and can tailor their support for their local areas. And then so in Swansea, for example, which is different to quite a few of the local authorities, we run an advisory service, and we also delegate funding directly to schools. So the data helps us to inform those decisions about the type of school support the advisors offer in terms of training and resource allocation. At school level, the data guides the support that's put in place for EAL learners. So knowing the stage of English will determine the specific strategies that individual learners will need, because there isn't a one-size-fits-all approach. You need to know the stage of English in order to then put in appropriate support for those learners. I also think actually that we do have that certain data that we need to collect, but there's also additional data that I think schools should be collecting as well to answer the key questions in order to provide support. So if I'm asked about supporting a learner, I'd want to know questions like, well, what is the stage of English? How long has the learner been in the UK for? Have they had prior education before arriving in the UK? Are they literate in their first language? All that information needs to be gathered. And I think the admissions process is absolutely essential in gathering that information, so that when you have had initial EAL assessment, you put that together to put a good package of support in place that's based on the individual needs. An example of that is one of the local schools. That information was absolutely vital in that they had, within an 18-month period, they had 2 late arrivals who started school in year 11. One arrived in October, one in November, and so they were classed as EAL learners. But when you use the information that the government requires, and also the school chose to ask for, what you discovered was one of the new arrivals was a stage D learner who had prior education, who was literate, and they were assessed as being a stage D learner, and they were entered for GCSEs and left with 5 GCSEs stages A to B. The other learner had not had prior education. They were assessed as being a stage A learner. They were supported to acquire English and access the curriculum, as statutory requirement, of course, to access the curriculum. But the support that they were provided was very different. There were 2 different pathways involved, and there were 2 pathways about what their next steps at post-16 were as well. So it's really important about gathering information and then how that information is used.
2 very clear examples. Thank you for that, Jo. How do you ensure that EAL assessment is both robust and accurate?
Yeah, this is an interesting one, isn't it? So it's the moderation is important, isn't it? And within schools, EAL coordinators tend to gather the evidence, but it's not solely down to them to make that decision. There's a lot of discussion with subject teachers. In secondary, you have to be speaking to a wide number of teachers who are supporting the learner in the classroom. So there's that level of moderation. It's not down to just one person. Ultimately, one person will make the final decision, but it's gathering information from across the learners experiences within school. There's also cross-school collaboration. So there's a vertical collaboration between primary and secondary. The project that I worked on with University of Reading really focused on the need. That wasn't the reason for the project, but we focused on the need as we all needed to have a clear understanding of what we meant by the different stages. And so we had the moderation, and lots of us then took that back into our schools or into the local authority to focus on that need to understand, have a shared and consistent understanding of what we meant by C and D. It's usually those ones that cause the most, well, not confusion, but they're the ones that there are some inconsistencies. So as a local authority, we offer universal and bespoke training to schools, and regardless of what the name of the package is, we often slip in a moderation exercise as well, to discuss that and to make sure that we've got some consistency. I've also, as secondary lead, run moderation exercises for my secondary colleagues where we've taken exemplar models and discussed what we and have an agreement of what we feel is. That really works if you've got movement between secondary schools within a local authority. You know that when they're coming from one school to another, that the data that comes with them is robust and you know, you don't have to then just check. And I think the purpose of the moderation is really to develop a shared understanding of the stages. We've got to have consistency. If you've got the correct stage, then you're going to use that to ensure appropriate support. You're going to have monitoring progress and robust data at the end of that. And I think, referencing another report that Strand and Lindorff did in 2020, mentioned there actually that the Welsh data did have some inconsistencies. So that's what we wanted to make sure that that we're addressing that.
Thank you. And I've only have very little time because we want to move on to questions from the audience, but very quickly, can you tell us your reflections about the key findings of the latest report and what are the implications for the Welsh context?
Well, I think it's reassuring that collecting proficiency in English data is something that's seen that we need to do. So yes, that's great. But I think the key implication for Wales really is focusing on moderation and our 5-stage model across Wales. I mean, we've got a model, but we need to have an agreed or national assessment framework that sits under it. So that will to ensure consistency of the application of it. And then that should then lead to more accurate data and enable everybody to plan for more effective support.
Thank you so much, Jo. And now you three, questions from the audience, and there are quite a few. So first, I'm asking a question of you, Ariel. I don't know the name of the participant, but somebody asked, is there any data to show what percentage of late in-term arrivals are EAL pupils in primary schools? Let's answer this one first, and there's a kind of follow-up.
Sorry, can you say that? I don't have that one in front of me. Can you say that again?
Yeah. Is there any data to show what percentage of late in-term arrivals are EAL pupils in primary schools?
Not offhand, although that's a thing that I presume we could look at that. That's not here right in front of me, but that's a thing that could be dug into. Yeah, sorry, I don't have an answer offhand.
No worries. Thank you. And also, the same person asks, does London outperform the rest of the UK in closing the attainment gap for these late arrival EAL pupils? You are muted, Ariel, sorry.
Yeah, I'm just thinking for a moment. We do see, if I'm remembering correctly, I have to refresh my memory a little bit. I do think we saw a regional difference in gaps, and I do think we saw the gaps being smaller in London. There's probably some more unpacking of that we would need to do, though, because I think the risk with these sorts of data is that we can draw a lot of inferences around what might be driving them, but there are more kind of questions raised by those sorts of patterns than answers. I think we did see smaller gaps in London, if I remember. correctly, but obviously we can't fully explain those, and it might be to do with kind of structurally where we see late arrivals coming in later years. So it's something that needs a little more study to explain, certainly.
Okay, thank you. Now a question for Susanna. How would you raise the importance of supporting EAL pupils in a secondary school? Well, this is not for Susanna, is it? Sorry, this is not for Susanna. How do we identify children with EAL needs and the different needs from the different children? How can we support them?
I would definitely start with just assessing their language proficiency. But then sort of also giving those children opportunities to experience the school in different ways and doing skill-based and knowledge-based activities, just to see if there are any gaps. Again, it sort of depends on where the child is and what point of entry and what you would sort of expect your English, your sort of monolingual learners, where you set them to be, and look at the differences and the similarities between them.
Thank you. And again, sorry about all these ads that I'm putting out. There's a webinar that was done with the authors of the EAL and SEND guidance that the Bell Foundation commissioned. Then there's more information about that if you're interested. Susanna, another question for you. What assessment approach should schools use in terms of EAL language? And a kind of follow-up, how often should EAL pupils be assessed?
I recommend assessment at least once a term, once a half term, ideally, especially if you are noticing a child making quite an accelerated progress in class. And so what was the first part of the question, Silvana?
It is, what assessment approach should schools use in terms of EAL language? So language proficiency, yeah, of those pupils.
Again, I think it depends on what suits you and what suits your setting and sort of what you agree on. I think that the main thing is that whatever approach a school takes is consistent throughout the school.
Thank you.
It's a discussion within the individual setting.
Right. I'll come back to you because there are more questions. But let's get Joe now. So Joe, what are the most effective strategies to support late EAL arrivals who may have zero English and are illiterate in their mother tongue and have no or limited previous education in their home language?
Yeah, so there are a variety of strategies that I'd recommend in terms, and I have a look at the Bell Foundation strategy book as well. But it's a lot of it is about focusing on visuals and basic language initially, building up vocabulary, and you can do that within the lessons by focusing on the key vocabulary that you are wanting from that lesson. So what is the key subject specific language, and tying that into visuals as well, making the context that they're learning in real. So you may want to do focused English language sessions, but they have to be in a real and meaningful context based on the curriculum content as well. So it's about looking about what's being taught and pulling out key words, key phrases, pairing learners with their peers who share the same language, grouping learners with good role models of English, preparing them for their next stages as well in when they move post 16. So there's a whole package that's got this, that social support, the language support. I know is what really the question was about, but it all comes in together, doesn't it? So it's about focusing on the keywords, key phrases, good models of support, using first language. There are things like immersive reader, and Microsoft Word Online, where if they're not literate in the first language, you can still translate documents, and then it will read that information out to the learners as well, so they can utilize their first language as well in the classroom to access the curriculum.
Thank you. A question for Ariel. Is there a standard definition of what constitutes an EAL learner? And this is because of Joe's definition, and the participant says it seems that people use the term in different ways. So probably the question applies to England, I imagine.
Yes, so I suppose the operational definition in the system really has to do with whether or not there's early exposure and continued exposure to another language in the home. So in England, EAL status is picking up anyone who had another language at home early on and continues to have another language at home. It doesn't pick up anything about the literacy in the different languages or the fluency in the different languages at home, or whether or not English is also spoken at home.
And presumably this is why we stress the importance of assessment of proficiency in English, right?
Absolutely, because just looking at EAL status gives us a really heterogeneous group with really different needs and really different performance across their academic subjects. So.
Thank you. And another question for you, Ariel. What funding is there for EAL children?
That's not so easy to unpack right now because we're moving away from a model where that's really ring-fenced. So I don't think it's so clear to anybody really at the moment. But I think we can see what funding we think there should be. It used to be that there was sort of earmarked 3 years of funding when a pupil arrived, but that's not so clear-cut anymore in the national funding formula.
Thank you. So more about this later. Watch this space, really. Thank you. Okay, another question, a couple of questions for Susanna now. Susanna, what help is there for the parents of EAL learners who may also struggle to become proficient in English?
Very little in short. I've seen individual schools really embrace the community and organize sort of their own the community evenings and coffee mornings and to help parents and language classes. But again, that was up to individual schools or individual trusts. There's nothing sort of widely available really that I know of, unless sort of individual counties have come up with help.
Thank you. And yeah, what you mentioned, if I remember rightly, was pointed out in a report authored by Heather Rolfe on supporting migrant children and their parents. And they do recommend, particularly for those groups that are harder to reach, if you like, that the school is a center for gathering parents and carers, etc. So the recommendation was that, if possible, if they could have ESOL lessons in the school as opposed to just in college, for example. Thank you. More work to be done on this one, eh? Thank you very much. Yes, and then I'll come back to you later. Another question for Joe. I'm scrolling, sorry about this. Joe, here we are. Joe, do schools need a dedicated EAL department, and who should be delivering EAL support in a school?
I'm not sure whether you need a department. I mean, funding will come into that, won't it? That dictates an awful lot about what goes on in a school. I think you need a lead EAL coordinator, which is a dedicated role, rather than somebody who is in secondary, maybe teaching science, worrying about the exams, and then having a bit of EAL. I think you need a dedicated EAL coordinator's role who can then offer guidance to teachers within the school, can target particular learners for support, can help set up the model of support within the school, can liaise with parents and pupils and other agencies. So I think you do need a dedicated role, but I think it's everybody's role in school to support an EAL learner, and it's about managing that EAL coordinator ensuring that everybody in the school has a role to play in supporting EAL learners.
Thank you, Jo. And there's a question here. Is there a standard form used to assess learners when they join the school? This is a participant in Leicestershire saying it's not something we currently have in place.
Is that for me?
Yes.
Oh, sorry. We would tend to, as I say, there's the 5-stage model descriptors, which are very similar to the Bell Foundation. So we would use evidence of conversations, reading, taking work from the classroom, independent writing. And so initially you would maybe see the writing that pupils do, you would have conversations with them, you would read, you just have conversation and then talk about texts, and then use that to inform your judgments about their stages of English based on the descriptors.
Okay, thank you. This is a question I'm going to throw at the ether and see who would like to pick it up. What should be the basic offer of support for all students with EAL, assessment of proficiency, and then what? Who would like to take that one?
You assess them and you find out what their individual needs are. Some EAL learners will be fluent, they won't need support. Others will be stage D learners who you can offer guidance to class teachers in terms of that pupil teacher review, pointing out targeting specific errors. And then there may be other learners who are new to English who need a more defined program. So it really is about the individual pupil. Yeah.
Thank you. Would you like to add anything, Susanna, there?
Yeah, I think obviously I'm just going to echo what I've said before, just that whatever the strategies are, they need to be whole school strategies and they need to be consistent. And again, that will then help a lot with sort of time and prep. But again, it's what's appropriate for your school, because as we know, it's not a clear-cut, simple thing where we can say every school should be doing X or Y. But as long as things are, agreed and consistent, you can see real benefits and children making a lot of progress in very short amount of time.
Thank you. And maybe something for you to clarify, Ariel. The question is, are you aware of similar attainment data for other countries in the UK? So the report, what countries in the UK does it draw on?
So the report itself, we look at England in this case, but some of the previous reports in the series, as Jo mentioned, we looked at Wales as well. And this was when we didn't have the proficiency data in England. We sort of looked to Wales to learn some lessons there where they did have statutory assessment of English language proficiency. So that's the main one I'm aware of. I'm sure there is probably additional, I know there's other data available. We haven't looked at those in particular, although I would be interested to compare in the future.
And the last question, probably for Jo, how would you raise the importance of supporting EAL pupils in a secondary school, particularly with senior leadership team and with regards funding, training and support?
Well, I would say is vital, absolutely vital. It's as the data says, joining later and for older children coming towards the end of statutory education, it is so important that support is provided to the language acquisition of those learners. Before they're leaving statutory education and moving on, we need to get support in place. In terms of funding, our funding is different to England, so funding is allocated on just by being an EAL learner, and then that is allocated to the local authorities to decide how that funding is then used, as I mentioned earlier. So if schools are being given some funding, I would always make the argument to, if it's in Wales, it is demarcated as the MEGRT funding, so that funding can be used to provide for staff and resources. So if you have specific funding, you should be using it absolutely to support your EAL learners, particularly in secondary. I mean, it's no more than primary, but secondary is incredibly important in terms of next steps to future careers for our learners.
Thank you so much. I would listen to you for many more hours, but I'm afraid that's all we've got time for. Thank you so much, Ariel, Susanna, and Joe, for your insights of very useful information about research findings, about implications for practice and policy. So that brings us to the end of our webinar. But before we finish, you will see in a minute on the screen a QR code and a link to download the new report by lead author Dr. Ariel Lindorf and the team at the Department for Education at the University of Cambridge. So you've got your QR code, you've got the link. Don't worry, we will send a link tomorrow as well. And also you will see on the screen more QR codes. So this one that you see right now is to find out more about some of the professional learning opportunities that we have coming up at the Bell Foundation. So this one is about courses and webinars run online nationally by the Bell Foundation. So as you see, you've got 2 starts in January, on the 13th of January, one supporting new arrivals who are new to English, those bands A, new to English, and leading on EAL assessment. So for all those middle and senior leaders who want to know more about how you can, have a strategy to lead on EAL assessment, this is the course for you. And then the next slide, that QR code allows you to access information about our regional CPD events run by our team of licensed practitioners like Susanna here present today. So if you want to know more about what's happening in your area and engage with your local Bell Foundation licensed practitioner, just check that QR code and that link. Finally, a quick reminder that you will get an email tomorrow with a link to the video recording of this webinar, a link to the report, and also a link to a post-course evaluation. We would be really grateful if you could spend a few moments to complete this post-course evaluation, course meaning webinar, as your views will help us shape future events. Thank you so much for taking part in today's webinar, and thanks again to today's brilliant speakers, Ariel, Susanna, and Joe, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Take care and bye.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody.